The silent collapse. Why the age of infinite information is creating the dumbest generation. Imagine a world where we have instantaneous access to more recorded information, data, and knowledge than at any other point in human history. Every library, every university lecture, every philosophical text is literally at our fingertips. Yet somehow we are rapidly becoming less capable of thinking critically, reasoning deeply, or distinguishing complex truth from comforting illusion. Take a moment to truly contemplate that disturbing paradox. Never before have we been so technically connected to the global information network, and yet so intellectually disconnected from the actual texture of reality, from the simple process of genuine internal thought. Today we're going to uncover a chilling, disturbing paradox. How, in this glittering age of infinite, streaming knowledge, we are actively creating what might be recorded as the most intellectually passive, shallow, and distracted generation in history. And I promise you, the last unsparing revelation of this video is the most shocking of all, because it exposes the true root cause behind this silent intellectual collapse, a cause that few in the media or academia dare to talk about openly. But before we dive into this critical investigation, make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and most importantly, share this video with those who still mistakenly believe that intelligence automatically grows in direct proportion to technological advancement. I assure you that what you'll discover today might fundamentally change the way you see modern education, the endless scroll of social media, and even your own daily habits of thought. Let us begin. 1. The illusion of competence. Addiction to input. For centuries, the acquisition of knowledge was regarded as something sacred, a profound, difficult journey. Ancient philosophers like Socrates and Confucius believed that true wisdom came not from knowing every single thing, but from the humble, constant practice of recognizing how little one truly knows. The disciplined mind was considered a temple, and learning was a sacred, lifelong ritual of patience, humility, and relentless self-examination. But in our current age of digital, overwhelming abundance, information is no longer a guarded treasure. It's an uncontrolled, torrential flood. It is a never-ending, high-velocity stream of content, notifications, and updates that actively drowns out reflection and viciously rewards distraction. Psychologists have a name for this intellectual danger: the illusion of competence. We rapidly scroll through endless facts, sensational videos, and short, sharp sound bites. And we tragically mistake this rapid, passive exposure for genuine, integrated understanding. We feel constantly informed, yet our thoughts are increasingly shallow, our attention is terminally fractured, and our ability to think independently, slowly, quietly, decays. As neuroscientist Daniel Levitin explains, the modern world has intentionally made us addicted to relentless input, but allergic to quiet, deep reflection. Ask yourself honestly, when was the last time you sat with a single, complex idea for more than 15 minutes, without compulsively checking your phone, switching tabs, or feeling that anxious internal pull to move on to the next piece of trivial content? That profound inability to sustain focus is not a passive accident of technology. It is a deliberate design. Social platforms are meticulously engineered to hijack and exploit your dopamine system, rewarding you instantly for shallow, fragmented engagement, and actively punishing you for sustained stillness or concentration. In the past, genuine intellectual growth required immense patience, mental discipline, and often solitude. Today, we have been conditioned to reward speed over profound depth, constant noise over illuminating silence, and knee-jerk reaction over deliberate reasoning. The terrifying, inevitable consequence is a generation that catastrophically confuses being informed with being wise. Philosopher Neil Postman warned us of this intellectual catastrophe decades ago in his prophetic work, Amusing Ourselves to Death, when he stated that we risk becoming a people who love their oppression and adore the technologies that undo their capacities to think. What is truly terrifying is that we have collectively accepted this severe intellectual decline as the uncomfortable new normal. We openly mock seriousness, idolize shallow influencers over profound thinkers, and celebrate short, manic bursts of content as acceptable education. Studies at major universities have found that constant digital multitasking catastrophically rewires the brain, making deep, singular thought inherently more difficult and painful. The more we jump compulsively between notifications, messages, and media feeds, the more our neural pathways physically adapt to expect interruption as the default state. In other words, the very biological mechanism by which we think is being fundamentally reshaped by the technology we are dependent upon. And here lies the agonizing irony. We mistakenly think we're intellectually evolving, but cognitively, we're rapidly regressing. Critical thinking, high-level creativity, and genuine empathy are being replaced by algorithmic predictability, the tyranny of certainty, and the fear of intellectual effort. So, I must ask you, are we truly becoming smarter or simply more efficient at being quietly controlled? Because true intelligence is not defined by how much information we can consume, but by how we intentionally process, deeply integrate, and consciously apply it. True intelligence transforms raw knowledge into wisdom, and wisdom, by its very nature, cannot survive in a frantic culture addicted to terminal distraction. 2. The industrialization of ignorance, education, and media. The modern education system was, in its ideal form, designed to enlighten minds, to cultivate relentless curiosity, and to prepare individuals for a life of thoughtful, independent contribution. But somewhere along the disastrous path of standardization, it transformed into a machine, one that rigidly values conformity over creativity, rote memorization over conceptual understanding, and passive obedience over critical thought. Think about the central irony. We send children to school for more than a decade, yet most graduate without ever being explicitly taught how to think. They learn what to think, what to repeat, what to believe, but never the fundamental processes of how to question the world, the authorities, and their own assumptions. Sir Ken Robinson famously stated, "Schools kill creativity," and he was not exaggerating for effect. Our current institutions are built entirely upon an industrial 19th century model, designed to produce standardized minds to fit into standardized systems. And those systems, in turn, feed the very consumer culture that rewards ignorance disguised as superficial entertainment. When we teach students that there is only one right answer to every question, we brutally kill the spirit of intellectual exploration that fuels genuine, high-level intelligence. The philosopher Jiddu Krishnamurti warned that it is no measure of health to be well-adjusted to a profoundly sick society. Yet this is exactly what our current education prepares us for, to adapt mindlessly to a system that values productivity over wisdom, superficial image over genuine substance, and compliant obedience over painful truth. And once this foundational conditioning begins, It does not stop in the classroom. It relentlessly extends into the media we consume, the jobs we take, and the lives we build around the false promises of convenience. The modern media landscape is no longer a tool for objective information. It is a sophisticated instrument of emotional manipulation. News outlets compete not to calmly inform, but to viciously provoke. Algorithms show us not what we need to know for context, but what keeps us emotionally charged, politically divided, and constantly engaged in a reactive state. Every click, every scroll, every performative outrage is ruthlessly monetized. In this digital coliseum, critical, nuanced thinking is not rewarded. Raw, immediate emotion is. The more reactive, polarized, and impulsive you are, the more valuable you become, not as a citizen, but as data. As journalist Matt Taibbi described, we don't have information wars anymore. We have anger wars. And anger, fear, and sustained distraction are the perfect psychological tools to ensure that people never pause long enough to ask the critical question: who truly benefits from my intellectual ignorance and my emotional instability? It is crucial to understand. It's not that human beings are becoming inherently, biologically dumber. It's that we are being systematically programmed to remain intellectually passive. We willingly outsource our thinking to shallow influencers, attention-seeking celebrities, and highly polarized commentators who tell us exactly what to believe, what to hate, and what to feel. And we naively call that state awareness. But awareness without deep internal reflection is merely noise. And noise, when repeated long enough, becomes the deafening soundtrack of a culture in precipitous decline. The late philosopher Marshall McLuhan famously said, "The medium is the message." In other words, the very way we receive information fundamentally shapes the very way we think. When we consume endless, short-form, rapid-fire content, our minds adapt to that rhythm. Fast, shallow, and impulsive. This constant, manic stimulation leaves absolutely no room for deep comprehension, for the virtue of patience, or for rigorous critical analysis. Our economy thrives on this exact superficiality. A distracted, restless person is the perfect consumer. A mind that is perpetually restless buys more, scrolls more, and fundamentally questions less. Entire global industries are built on the single premise that your finite attention can be captured, relentlessly fragmented, and sold to the highest bidder. The more you react to the stimuli, the more valuable you become, not as a thinker, but as data. And while we are constantly entertained and distracted, the collective intelligence of society quietly, irrevocably erodes. We are raising generations who no longer read books, but rely on flimsy summaries, who no longer debate complex ideas, but immediately cancel opposing voices, who no longer seek deep truth, but merely instant validation. 3. The crisis of consciousness, the profit of intellectual weakness. We live in an era where sustained distraction is the new currency, and your attention is the single most valuable commodity. Every second of your focus is relentlessly fought over by companies, platforms, and institutions that have learned one simple, brutal truth. A distracted mind is an obedient mind. And the more fragmented your attention becomes, the easier it is to control your thoughts, manipulate your emotions, and ultimately dictate your beliefs. This systematic fragmentation is not accidental, it is a calculated design. Psychologist B.F. Skinner, one of the pioneers of behavioral conditioning, demonstrated that if you reward people randomly and intermittently, they will compulsively keep repeating an action endlessly. That same core principle is used in every successful social media application today. Every notification, every like, Every new video is a tiny, random dopamine reward, a digital treat that keeps you constantly hooked. We have, effectively, become laboratory rats in a massive psychological experiment we never consented to or understood. The consequences of this conditioning go far beyond wasted time. Constant, high-volume exposure to digital noise is physically changing the structure of our brains. Studies in neuroplasticity show that what we pay attention to literally rewires our neural pathways. When our minds are relentlessly trained for speed, novelty, and instant gratification, deep, sustained thinking feels profoundly uncomfortable. Silence becomes psychologically unbearable, and boredom, once the birthplace of all creativity, now feels like a problem to be frantically solved. Author Nicholas Carr, in his essential book, The Shallows: What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains, articulates this perfectly. What the net seems to be doing is chipping away my capacity for concentration and contemplation. This slow, silent erosion of our fundamental capacity for attention is the hidden epidemic of our age. And it's not just making us less intelligent, it's making us exponentially easier to control. Because when people no longer possess the patience and mental stamina to think deeply, they instinctively start to believe whatever is emotionally easiest and most immediate to believe. In this climate, propaganda thrives not through blatant censorship, but through overwhelming overload. When everything is information, nothing is truth. The philosopher Hannah Arendt gave a chilling warning. The ideal subject of a totalitarian regime is not the convinced communist or the committed fascist. It is the person for whom the distinction between fact and fiction no longer exists. And that, tragically, perfectly describes much of our modern culture. We are so bombarded with content that we no longer know what is truly trustworthy. Instead of rigorously verifying, we simply absorb. Instead of thinking, we impulsively react. The result is a kind of profound intellectual numbness, a paralysis of analysis. People feel informed yet remain utterly powerless, constantly connected yet intellectually isolated, surrounded by endless opinions, yet starved for any genuine cohesive understanding. And this is the exact environment where mediocrity is not only tolerated, but actively glorified. Look around. Everywhere we see the celebration of ignorance disguised as authenticity. Genuine intelligence is mocked as elitism, and intellectual simplicity is championed as a core virtue. The more complex the world becomes, the more frantically we cling to simplistic, comforting illusions. Psychologist Carl Jung once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." And in this age, the soul we most fear facing is our own intellect. This is precisely why critical thinking has become a radical act. To think deeply is to resist. To question is to rebel. 4. The final revelation: reclaiming your sovereignty. At the very heart of this vast intellectual crisis lies a single, profound, unvarnished truth. The system does not want you to think, not truly. Because a genuinely thinking individual is inherently unpredictable. A thinking individual questions the premises, resists the narrative, and immediately sees beyond the illusion. And absolutely nothing is more dangerous to control than a mind that has fully awakened to its own sovereign power. When philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche warned, "The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe," he was describing precisely what we see today. A mass culture that relentlessly punishes independent thought and hysterically rewards thoughtless conformity. The tribe has simply become digital, and instead of being burned at the stake, thinkers are now burned on social media, ridiculed, silenced, and exiled from the comfort of collective approval. The dumbing down of humanity is not a passive side effect of technological progress. It is the fundamental active mechanism by which global control is maintained. A distracted, divided, and emotionally unstable population cannot organize, cannot resist, and cannot possibly evolve. The ancient philosopher Plato warned that when ignorance governs the mind, society inevitably collapses into chaos. He called it the tyranny of the ignorant, where people actively prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable, effortful truths. And is that not exactly where we find ourselves today? Drowning in knowledge but desperately starved of wisdom. But here is the final, ultimate revelation, the one I promised from the beginning. Intelligence is not something we are losing. It is something we are actively, willingly surrendering. Every single time we let a screen think for us, every time we accept an answer without questioning its source or premise, every time we trade deep internal reflection for shallow, external convenience, we are giving away a fragment of our sovereignty. And that surrender, repeated billions of times over generations, creates the terrifying illusion that intelligence itself is simply vanishing. But it is not gone. It is merely dormant, waiting to be fiercely reclaimed. The philosopher René Descartes famously concluded, "I think, therefore I am." But today, we might more accurately say, "I scroll, therefore I forget." To reclaim our minds, we must consciously remember what it means to think, not as an act of ego, but as a moral act of absolute freedom. To think is to reclaim your attention, to observe your thoughts without being ruled by them, to choose sustained silence over perpetual noise, to seek genuine understanding over cheap, immediate validation. Thinking is not a luxury in this age. It is a moral and intellectual responsibility in a world built entirely on manipulation. If you wish to escape the gravitational pull of collective engineered stupidity, start by doing what the system fears most. Disconnect. Create sustained distance between yourself and the constant, relentless stream of stimulation. Read deeply. Reflect slowly. Ask questions that no algorithm is capable of answering. The ancients understood this. The Greek Stoics practiced stillness to master the mind. The Buddhists practiced mindfulness to dissolve illusion. Even modern psychologists like Viktor Frankl discovered that meaning is not found in what happens to us, but in how we consciously interpret and respond to it. That is what profoundly separates the conscious human from the conditioned one. Despite everything, we are not doomed to stupidity. The same tools that enslave us can also free us if we learn to use them consciously. Technology is not the enemy is unconsciousness. When we use tools mindfully, they amplify intelligence. When we use them blindly, they replace it. So the final, defining question for this generation is, will you remain a passive consumer of noise or become an active creator of thought? This generation still has a profound choice. It can continue down the path of distraction, where depth disappears and consciousness collapses. Or it can awaken and remember that intelligence is not measured by what we know, but by our sovereign capacity to understand, to question, and to grow. This awakening begins in silence. It begins when you put the phone down, close the screen, and sit with your own thoughts long enough to remember that your mind is not a product. It's a universe, a living, breathing field of consciousness capable of infinite expansion. When you feed it only manufactured fragments, it withers. But when you nurture it with depth, with reflection, and with truth, it evolves. That is how civilizations truly rise, not through faster machines, but through human minds that consciously refuse to be programmed. Minds that dare to imagine a better reality and then possess the courage to create it. This is not just a warning, it's an invitation. An invitation to think again, to observe again, to live consciously again. Because the world does not need more shallow opinions. It desperately needs more awareness. The dumbest generation in history will not be the one that lacked knowledge, but the one that forgot how to use it. Don't let that be us. The real revolution begins in the mind, because the future will not belong to the smartest machines. It will belong to the most conscious humans.